So our next speaker today is Dr. Matthew Barr. You are? Okay. So Dr. Matthew Barr is a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, where he convened the university's first game studies course and founded the International Student Games Studies Journal. Press start. His research, which attracted significant media attention, examines how video games may be used to develop skills and competencies such as critical thinking, adaptability, and communication skills. So we're going to be hearing about how games can make us better employees. So please give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Hi there. Yes, that was a nice long introduction. I don't need to introduce myself now. I'm Matt. I'm down from the University of Glasgow, where I am a lecturer, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about how I think games can maybe make people better employees. So this is John Seeley Brown. He's an academic, yes, but he is also a business person. He has worked for Deloitte, Amazon, Xerox, and he has rather famously said that he would rather hire someone who's really good at World of Warcraft than someone with an MBA from Harvard, okay? So what's he talking about here? Well, what he's talking about is the idea that games help develop the kinds of skills that we want in business. So things like collaboration and strategic thinking. Now, clearly Brown here is being somewhat playful, maybe a little bit deliberately provocative, but he is not alone in thinking this. And apologies for the parade of greying white men, myself included. I know this is shit. So this is James Paul Gee, okay? Anyone who's looked at game-based learning will have come across Gee's work. He's a professor of literacy studies at Arizona State University. And he's noted that learning is a deep human need, like mating and eating, and all such needs, it is meant to be deeply pleasurable to human beings. Sort of not like we remember school, probably, right? And I can assure you that the students don't run from my lectures screaming how deeply pleasurable it was. I try. So Gee has pointed out that part of what makes games fun and engaging is actually the learning process, right? Games are often about learning. The fun comes out of mastering their systems, mastering the game. And Gee has gone on to develop no less than 36 learning principles that he has observed in complex modern video games by watching people play them and master them. Some of those principles are things like the active and critical learning principle, which says that the learning environment, which of course in this case is the game, is set up to encourage active and critical engagement and learning rather than just being passively talked to like this, right? There are other things in there like one of my favorites is the psychosocial moratorium principle. He is a professor of literacy studies, which basically means, as Joe mentioned there, that games are a safe space to experiment, to try things out, right? So we get to learn about the world in a safe space. And this is no accident, right? So games are designed to teach us, right? Game developers, game designers have been honing the art of teaching people how to play their games for as long as they've been game developers. They write books about it. We teach our students how to teach, our game design students, how they would teach their players to play the game. So Ralph Koster is one such game designer who has written one such book, which I think is a very accessible and useful introduction to game design and has lots of pictures, so my students like it. And Ralph has a whole section in there on learning, right? It's so fundamental to the design of a game that he has a section on it. And he notices that, actually getting people to learn what you want them to learn, and I can sympathize with this, can be difficult, right? Because one of the points he makes is humans are wired to cheat, right? We want to find the easy way. We want to solve the maths problem without writing out our solution. And there's an evolutionary advantage to this, right? Cheating is good for you. It's, I think the example he gives is in a duel, the person who turns around and shoots the other person in the back is the one that's going to carry on and have babies, right? So there is an evolutionary advantage to cheating. So in game design, you need to be able to teach the player how to play the game while keeping it fun and preventing them from cheating. So by cheating, I mean skipping the lesson, right? Because if they don't get the lesson at the start, they'll not be able to play the next part of the game and so on. And so there's a lot we can learn from more formal teaching from games, I think. And Coster mentions things like certain aspects of game design that need to be borne in mind. He describes what he calls the mastery problem. He says that people of varying skill, whether they've mastered the game or not, should be able to get something out of it, and they should be able to learn how to play the game. He thinks that games should have variable feedback, so depending on the skill and the strategy you use, you'll get something else back from it. And finally, he suggests that games should punish failure, essentially, right? And that's somewhat more controversial, but of course, if you keep making the game easier, then you're cheapening the experience, right? And the player isn't going to learn what they need to master the next level. It's kind of the same reasons we have exams at university and so on, right? If you don't pass first year, you can't go into second year because you're not ready. So the two things, what I'm trying to say here is that both learning and game design are kind of go hand in hand. If you pick up any game design text, you will find lots of the same theories and ideas in there as you would find in an educational text. Often the names are different. Like not many game design books talk about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? Which is about how you scaffold learning, but that's present and correct in game design, just as it is in the classroom. So hopefully that's sort of sold the idea that games, can be useful for learning. And before I talk a little bit about some of the work we did at Glasgow, I want to talk about a direct inspiration. And that is the work of Kurt Squire, who was previously at University of Wisconsin at Madison. And while he was there, he did his doctorate in teaching world history to college students using this game, which is, I know this room knows what this is. You're like my students. It's like, this is Civilization 3. So Kurt got his PhD by using Civilization 3 to teach world history to college students. And these were not necessarily the top flight students. Many of them, I think, had failed the course before. But what Kurt did is he brought Civilization into the classroom and had them play it under his supervision. He would jump in and give little, what he called just-in-time lectures from time to time. And after some initial resistance, some of the students were like, what the hell is this? Why are we playing a game at college? He got some success out of it. What he discovered was that the students began to develop a conceptual understanding of history and politics and geography, and they began to understand world history as a kind of system of interlocking factors, of interrelated factors. And then perhaps in a more sophisticated sense, they started to develop their critical thinking. They started to interrogate, well, what are the limitations of civilization as a system? What's it not telling us? And then even more sophisticated questions like, where does bias come into this, right? This is an American product. Does that mean that the Americans who designed it have brought their own bias, their own take on world history into its design? So those are quite sophisticated questions that, previously failing students were beginning to ask. But the thing about games like Civilization is there is learning going on, but it's not facts and figures, right? It's not like certainly 25 years ago I was taught history at school where you learn things off by rote. It's about understanding the world as a system. It's about developing that critical thinking. It's about developing the adaptability to deal with a rapidly changing circumstances. And that's where we came in. So the work we did at Glasgow was focused on developing these employability type skills. Specifically, we looked at communication. We looked at adaptability, which this clearly demonstrates, and resourcefulness, at which point I gave up on trying to find funny clip art and just gave you a picture of MacGyver because fuck it. So these three employability skills we chose because they're amongst the attributes that our university claims to be developing our students in order to prepare them for the workplace. It's part of the story we tell employers about why it's so good to come to Glasgow, right? And all universities have these. They call them different things, but it's what we say about our students. The other thing from a more practical point of view was I found ways of measuring these practically from the psychology literature. So we were able to measure these skills in students. And what we did was we set up an experiment over a semester. We recruited 100 undergraduate students and randomly assigned them to one of two groups. One group, seen here, would play selected games over the course of the semester, about 8 or 9 weeks, and the other group would not. So just to give a little bit of background on how it was set up, the lab, as you can see here, was set up on a drop-in basis, so the students could come along in between their classes or maybe instead of their classes. I didn't police that. As long as it wasn't one of my classes they were skipping, I didn't care. Come along and play the games. And we asked them to play 2 hours of each of the longer games and 1 hour each of 2 shorter games at the end. At the beginning of the semester, we measured the resourcefulness, the adaptability, and the communication skill of both groups, and then again at the end, so that we could calculate any differences in their attainment over the 8 weeks, to see if there's any difference in the group who played the games. Speaking of the games then, obviously everyone knows this one, Minecraft, and we set it up with a little server in the room so that the students could all collaborate together and work together, and also that world persisted, so as they dropped in and out they could come and work together. Borderlands 2, so obviously a team-based shooter, again played across the network, so people were collaborating in the room. Portal 2, obviously, if there's one game I think that should be played at university, I think it's probably Portal 2, but we played it entirely in the cooperative mode, so they were working together to solve those problems. Lara Croft and the Guardian of Light, again a cooperative game, working together to solve problems and advance through the world. A slightly older one, just because I liked it, but also because Warcraft 3, a real-time strategy game, it's exercising certain other skills as well, sort of adaptability and resourcefulness, but we played it on a team basis, so the students teamed up together and took on either the computer or competing human teams. So again, there was a collaborative element to it. Team Fortress 2, another shooter where people can take on lots of different roles and are thrown into lots of different scenarios as the nature of the game changes up. Then a slightly different take, Papers, Please. I'm sure most people in this room know what it is. Normally I have to explain, but so a game like this where you're examining these papers that people are presenting to you on the country's border, you have to apply a degree of critical thinking, and increasingly you have to be adaptable, you have to think in your feet because it keeps throwing different rules at you. Then the final one is Gone Home, right? First-person adventure story type game where you have to piece together the story yourself from a bunch of clues around this abandoned house. And of course the information is often incomplete, maybe even contradictory, and so you have to use your critical thinking to piece together the story. In terms of the results, I have spared you all the stats. I'll come back to that in a moment, but essentially what we found in the difference between the two groups was that the group who played the games had significant gains compared to the non-playing game group on all 3 of those attributes, on all 3 of those employability skills. The differences were what I would consider large, around about a standard deviation if you're into that stuff, and it didn't look like a fluke, right? The p-values, which are something we don't talk about so much anymore, the p-values were very good, and if you're into 95% confidence intervals, they didn't cross 0. It's a little treat for the stats heads. I am not a stats head. But the bottom line was that playing video games under these circumstances at university seemed to help students' employability skills. Now, what's relevant, I think, for today is that this is that rare example of a good news story that made the press. I think I'm somewhat baffled as to why it had such legs in the press, but I think it had something to do with the fact that it had those hard numbers in it. As I said, I don't think stats tell the whole story. We also conducted a whole bunch of interviews with the students who were involved to try and understand why they thought this was the case. I think that's just as important, and I found it just as enlightening. But the press likes stats. They like to be able to see that stuff, and there's a sort of randomized control flavor to the design of the work, and they go, oh, we recognize that. That's what the medics do. It must be good, right? So anyway, the press picked this up. I had a weird 36 hours where I was like on the radio in Singapore, and normally when you do radio, you get the producer talks to you, gives you a little bit of background. In this, no, I was just on the phone, and suddenly I was on the radio, and it was a very strange couple of days. But so what I would say about this is the media did not represent it very well. I was just moaning to Joe about this beforehand. At one point I was extremely worried I was going to have to explain to my vice principal why one of the tabloids was saying in order to get into university you should play video games and not study. What in what I just presented to you suggested that? I don't know. Also, you will all know this, don't read below the line, don't read the comments. That was fucking grim. But on a serious point, going by those comments, the readership of certain newspapers, bottom left, the public is not ready for this good news story. The public is not on board with games potentially being a force for good. And on that note, here's a quote from one of the UK's leading politicians. They become like blinking lizards, they being game players, motionless, absorbed, only the twitching of their hands showing they are still conscious. These machines teach them nothing. They stimulate no ratiocination, discovery, or feat of memory, though some of them may, cunningly pretend to be educational. Guess who that was? Yeah, so personally, and this is very much a personal comment, I'm quite happy to be in the wrong side of the argument from Boris Johnson. So I think I might be onto something. I will leave it there. Those are the links to the research if you're having difficulty sleeping, but please do follow up and you can find me on Twitter. Thank you very much.